So really to start, beginners should always pull this out. Just near the boundary of our tool shelf here, you can see we'll switch the cursor into this double arrowed thing. From there, left click and drag that out so we can see the names of everything. I think it's useful to have this on screen here that we can toggle on and off with the T key, T for tools. Once a little bit more comfortable with this, we'll probably close this and use Shift Space instead to get this kind of floating tool shelf, which also has the names of everything on it, thankfully. Whether Shift Space is what you're using for your tools can be found on the key map, and then we can take a look at the preferences. And this you might recognize when we first start Blender, the first time we launch a particular version. And we can see I've got my spacebar set to play. You might have that set to tools instead. But everything I'm using here is default, so it should be pretty easy to follow along. So first of all, I'm going to add in a new grease pencil, and I'm just going to click on the blank option. That has added this little orange dot that we can see there, and we now in our collection have this grease pencil. We're currently set to object mode, so let's switch to draw mode. And now if we try and click in the view, we can see a little error down here saying no available frame for creating the stroke. This little window at the bottom is the timeline, which we can find in our animation section of various windows that we can get here. And this one has access to this little button right here, which is auto keying. When we select that and enable it, then we can start to draw because it's created a keyframe. This is how things work if we were to have launched that 2D animation. And then if I left click and drag to another frame and then start to draw something else, you'll notice a new frame gets added, and now we can left click and drag between those two. But we can see in this window, we're not actually seeing any of the frames that we're laying down. But if we switch this instead of timeline to be a dope sheet and switch it from dope sheet to grease pencil, then suddenly we see our keyframes show up. What we need to bear in mind here though, is that if I switch back to object mode, let's use our add menu to add in a cube, for example, and then move that to the side, we can see that we've just laid down a load of keyframes for this, which might not have been the kind of behavior that we want. And so we can't toggle that option to auto keyframe from this particular window down here. So what I'm going to do is switch this back to a timeline, uncheck that option, delete the cube, jump back over to the dope sheet, make sure we're set to view grease pencil keyframes, and then I'll left click and drag the play header back to the first frame. And then once we select the grease pencil object, our keyframes should show up. And I'm going to select them both and delete them, since we want to really get familiar with the core, the fundamentals of how to set up the grease pencil for us to work in however we want to set up. So again, I'm going to switch back to draw mode and try to draw again. And again, we get this problem that we don't have an available frame. So what we're going to do is simply enough go to the draw menu and then find animation, and then we just have insert blank keyframe. It doesn't matter which of these two options we choose, because if we go over to our layers tab in the properties window, we don't really have more than one layer. Incidentally, if we didn't actually have a layer here, so if I remove that and then try to draw, again, nothing's happening there. Of course, we don't have the keyframe, but I think it's interesting to note that if we go to draw, then go to animation and then insert a blank keyframe, we get a layer automatically created for us to go along with this keyframe. Then we can go through and call this anything we like, or just keep it to the default name. Now we can left click and drag into the view there, and we're getting something. Let's switch over to the materials and notice that we don't have any materials here. That's why we're getting this kind of default sort of light gray. But if we give this a new material, we'll notice it all goes black. And I'm just going to call this lines. So to get around the view, we can middle click to rotate. We can hold shift and middle click to pan, and we can hold control and middle click to do a smooth zoom. But we can also use the mouse wheel to also zoom. We have these options down here. Here we can left click and drag to zoom. We can pan with the hand, or we can jump into the camera view, but we don't have a camera yet. And we can toggle between perspective, as we are now, as we can see in the top left, and orthographic view. Again, you can see that updates if you're in any doubt. And then we have these buttons that we can click on, which will align us to a particular axis if we want to. Clicking within the circle, but not on any of the axes, will allow us to rotate the view from here. I like to orient the view so that the blue Z axis is pointing straight upwards, and with the X direction running from left to right. And then I like to have positive Y running away from the screen. You don't have to have it set up to that orientation necessarily, but I do find that that consistency does end up paying off. Now notice that our brush strokes are a little bit weak. They're not fully black, and that's because the default strength is lower than 1. And then I'm also going to turn off the pen sensitivity. And now we can see that much more solid black line getting created, even if we did happen to be using a pen instead of a mouse. Instead of a black stroke, let's left click and drag on this swatch, brighten it up a little bit, maybe set it into a red kind of color. And the next thing I'd like to try and draw attention to is that this view, the solid shading view, which we can also get this little menu with the Z key. If we switch to the rendered view, which is the furthest one along, we can see we've suddenly lost that kind of red. And that's because if we come over to our layers, by default, every layer created will be set to use lights. So if we just uncheck that, we'll get a lot more of a similar view between our solid and rendered modes. It's useful to have these aligned, as if we start using some features like effects that we'll find on this tab, then they'll only show in rendered view, not in solid view. So this solid view will be like a simple working view that should stay pretty fast and responsive. Right now, we're not using any fancy features, so there should be no difference between solid and rendered view. Yet we can see there is a little bit of a change. That might be because of our world background, which we might want to brighten up. If we're drawing on a lighter background, maybe just slightly off white there, then we can take a look at solid shading view and it's completely changed. But thankfully, we can use this pull down to set it to also use the world. So I'm going to set the background to be world there. But here we have a background that doesn't look quite right. So that's because we need to duplicate this color onto the viewport display section. So I'm going to left click and drag that onto there. And now they should be much more aligned. But again, we can see a slight difference. And all that is now is because of our color management. So we come down to the color management and we see it's set to filmic. When we switch that over to standard, we should now see no perceptible difference between those two different views. Before we get started drawing, we might actually want to decide where to draw in this near infinite world of Blender perhaps, or do we want actually to animate a camera through our scene? Or maybe we'll just keep the camera static and just draw within the bounds of that camera view. Having a camera in the scene that is going to be used as our main movie camera is actually optional, because we could actually just render from here, from the view menu, just view, viewport, render image. But I'd say it's probably a very good idea to have a camera in your scene so that we don't sort of misalign our drawings, and it gives us the option to animate the camera later on if we want. To create a camera, we're going to need to be in the object level, because that would be an object command. Or in other words, you can think of it as we're definitely not drawing if we're trying to add a camera. So let's come over to the object mode, go Shift A instead of using the add menu there. Just go Shift A to bring that same menu here, and then we're going to go and find the camera. Camera shows up at the location of the 3D cursor, which is at the center of the world at the moment. So if I press N to open up the sidebar and click on the item tab there, we can see its location is 000. But for some reason, these are the default rotation values of the camera that you add into Blender. And I'm just going to zero all these out by left clicking and dragging and pressing 0. Then I'm going to rotate the camera to align it so that the x-axis, the red line that we have across our screen, runs left to right. And then the positive direction of Y goes off into the distance, which would put us here. That just means I can press G and then Y to constrain it along the Y-axis and put the camera about here. We can round that off if we like, maybe around -6. And then I know to rotate around the X-axis, we can go R and then X. And then you can see around 90, we can see that's positive 90 to point it straight at our grease pencil strokes. So I'm just going to type in 90 and then press enter. Now I'm going to press 0 on the numpad to jump into the camera. We've also got all these shortcuts available in the view menu as well. We've got the cameras there, so our numpad 0. But we've also got various different cameras, also all on the numpad. They're pretty handy to get the hang of. So with that, I'm going to shift middle click and then zoom up a little bit with the middle mouse wheel. And then let's come over to our camera settings. So we're still in object mode and we have our camera selected at the moment. If we don't see the right settings, we might have nothing selected, or we might have another object selected like the grease pencil. So we're going to need to make sure we have the camera selected and then we have a little camera icon. And that's where we're going to see these settings. We can change whether this camera is perspective or orthographic with this pull down menu. We can change the focal length, but I'm just going to keep that to what it was at 50. We have a clip setting, so if you've got some grease pencil drawings a kilometer away, then we might not see them. Just to really prove the point, if I set this down to 5, we know the camera is only 6 meters away from the origin. So as I pull this up to 6, we should start to see things show into view as they do there. So we want to make sure that this is set very reasonably so that things aren't going to clip where we don't expect. So I'm just going to set that up to 500. Depth of field does actually work with a grease pencil. It didn't used to, but now you can come to a grease pencil stroke, come to the effects, add a blur effect and set it to use the depth of field there. Then if we jump back to the camera settings by reselecting the camera, coming over here, find our depth of field, We know the focal distance is about 5 or 6 meters away. If we decrease the f-stop, we're going to make the blurring more intense. So our grease pencil should be the only thing in focus right now, but let's hold shift and left click on here to get fine control of this and pull this towards the camera. But something to bear in mind is that we're not going to see the effects of that blur in solid shading mode. We're going to need to switch over to rendered mode. And then from there, we can change our focus distance, hold left click and drag on here to be way more focused on something that might be near the camera. So I'm going to middle click and rotate out of the camera, select our grease pencil object, press Shift D to duplicate it, press Y to move it much closer to the camera, and then 0 on the numpad to zoom back in. I'm going to scale this down with the S key, just place it about there. Come back over to selecting the camera. You can also just select the camera by clicking on the borders of the camera in our viewport, and then come back over to the depth of field. And then as we change our focal distance, we can see we're focused right in on the foreground grease pencil stroke. And then we can switch from that to the background grease pencil stroke. So that's pretty cool, but we're going to disable the depth of field for the moment and take the near ground grease pencil object and delete it with X. Reselect the one over there and come to find our effects. And we're going to remove that blur. Maybe one other thing we might like to do with the camera is make sure the camera is selected. Come over to the viewport settings and increase the Pacifier 2 settings so that it becomes darker in the viewport in those areas beyond the camera's frame. Often I'll actually take that all the way to black. So all the way to 1, in other words. There's also this 3D crosshair in the center of our view. That's our 3D cursor. We can toggle the visibility of that among other things in our viewport overlays pull down menu. For now, I'm going to disable that. At this point, we're almost completely good to go. The only other thing to think about is to select the grease pencil, switch back into draw mode, and notice up here that our viewing plane, the drawing plane I should say, is set to view. So whatever we draw is going to be aligned with that. As we can see there, that's aligned to the camera view. If I start to draw here, we can see that was aligned to the temporary camera that we had at that time. When we set up our new 2D animation earlier on, that was actually set to use the front option there, and that aligns to our camera automatically. So if I was to draw like this, we can see it's now aligned. It now sticks to that plane, even though we weren't looking from that view. Something to bear in mind with that is if we were to obviously forget what we were doing and draw from here and think we're going to draw kind of a circular oval thing, then really we've not really done that. We've done much more of a flattened monstrosity, which might not have been what we were going for. To actually see the canvas at a glance, we can do that in the viewport overlays. We can come over to the draw grease pencil section and click on our canvas. Now, hopefully you can see that there is a grid that has appeared facing our camera. And as we now switch through these other options, we can see that grid change. Something else to bear in mind is that we also here have our onion skinning. So if we're doing animation, we're probably going to want that enabled. With that done though, congratulations, because so long as we're in draw mode on our grease pencil now, jumping into the camera, I'm going to actually disable our canvas though. We're actually good to go, and we've manually set up grease pencil ready to begin drawing. Apart from the fact that we have all this stuff, which I'm just going to delete all this stuff. There's several ways to do it, but I'm going to left click on this keyframe, press X to delete that keyframe. Then I'm going to use the shortcut key with the cursor in the main 3D view and go Shift I to add in a new keyframe. Then jump back into the camera, use the middle mouse wheel to scroll back into view, and we're all good to go.